Dakota Territory, 1888. While his neighbors raced to build standard 14 by 16 cabins before winter, one Dutch-American settler was still working in late September, wrapping his entire house in a giant haystack. They called it wasteful. They called him a fool. "You built a barn on top of a house," they laughed. He stacked hay 3 to 4 feet thick around every wall and over the roof, using 6 to 8 tons of loose straw held by a light pole frame. He built a 10-foot tunnel entrance that curved like a dog's leg to cut the wind. Standard frontier practice was thin walls, an iron stove, and hope. He was betting on what the Dutch knew: shelter the shelter with nature's own blanket. Then January 12th arrived. The thermometer nailed to his neighbor's porch read 38 below zero. A tin dipper left by the door was frozen solid. The killing cold that would become known as the schoolhouse blizzard hit without warning. Standard cabins burned through 3/4 of a cord per week just to hold 34 degrees. Water buckets filmed over with ice each night. But that fool's haystack cabin? It stayed 52 to 58 degrees with just 2 short fires per day, 21 degrees warmer than his neighbors at equal wood input. What did he understand about insulation, wind, and the slow heat of biology that everyone else missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Dawn broke over the Nebraska shortgrass country on November 15, 1888, with a thermometer nailed to Henrik van der Berg's porch post, reading 38 degrees below zero. The tin dipper he'd left by his door the night before was frozen solid, ice crystals forming perfect geometric patterns across its surface. Steam rose from his breath as he pushed through the 6-foot straw tunnel that led from his buried cabin to daylight, emerging into a world where the wind cut across the treeless flats with the force of a saw blade. From his neighbors' cabins, smoke poured thick and desperate from sheet iron stovepipes, the telltale sign of men feeding their fires continuously just to keep their families from freezing. But Vanderberg's chimney showed only the thin, controlled wisp of a fire that had been banked hours before. His cabin, completely invisible beneath its massive haystack shroud, held steady at 52 degrees, while his neighbors burned cord after cord just to maintain the low 30s. 3 months earlier, those same neighbors had gathered to watch Vanderberg's peculiar construction project with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "You built a barn on top of a house," called out Samuel Morrison, the storekeeper who supplied sheet iron stoves and roofing to most of the township. Morrison had built his own 14 by 16 cabin according to standard frontier practice. Thin log walls chinked with mud and moss, a red-hot iron stove, and the hope that enough split wood would carry him through the worst cold snaps. Vanderberg had started with a perfectly conventional one-room cabin, 14 by 18 feet of tight log construction with proper chinking and a sound roof. But then he'd done something that defied every piece of accepted wisdom about plains homesteading. He'd built a second structure around the first, a freestanding light frame of corner posts set 3 feet off his walls, cross-braced with saplings and topped with pole hoops. Into this framework, he'd stacked 6 to 8 tons of loose hay and straw, building up the mass in 12 to 16-inch lifts, treading each course down to 8 to 10 inches, then stitching the layers together with willow withes and baling twine every 3 feet to prevent slumping. The neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. Morrison shook his head as Vanderberg tamped another course of straw around what was rapidly becoming an enormous haystack with a cabin buried somewhere inside. "That's good fodder you're wasting," Morrison had said. "A man needs to feed his stock, not bury his house." Vanderberg had learned his methods from sources his neighbors didn't understand or trust. He'd grown up in a Dutch-settled farming region where hay barracks, hooibergen, were as common as corn cribs. The principle was simple: protect what mattered by sheltering it completely. A hay barrack used an adjustable roof and sturdy posts to keep tons of fodder dry through the wettest seasons. Vanderberg had simply inverted the logic, using the hay itself as the shelter and the cabin as what needed protecting. His mentor in this peculiar construction was Cornelius Decker, an elderly Dutchman who'd settled 2 sections over and who understood the craft of stacking fodder to withstand plains weather. Decker had shown Vanderberg how to set the 8 to 10-foot corner posts in 3-foot deep augured holes, how to brace them with 2x4 cross ties, and how to lash sapling stringers every 18 inches to create the framework that would hold thousands of pounds of straw. Most importantly, Decker had taught him the critical details that made the difference between a fire trap and a thermal fortress. The stovepipe presented the greatest challenge. Vanderberg had surrounded it with an 18-inch ring of packed mineral soil contained within a sheet metal collar, ensuring no straw came within 12 inches of any hot surface. He'd learned this fire prevention technique from Wilhelm Hoffmann, a market gardener who operated manure-heated hotbeds near the rail town. Hoffmann understood biological heat, the slow, steady warmth that came from controlled decomposition, and he'd explained how to manage the moisture and airflow that made the difference between beneficial fermentation and dangerous combustion. The tunnel entrance was Van der Berg's adaptation of plains-wined wisdom. He'd learned from Joseph Crow Feather, an Omaha hunter who'd taught him how prevailing northwest gales behaved on open ground. The tunnel ran 10 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 5 feet high, curving in an S shape to break the wind's force and capture drifting snow that would add even more insulation. The inside face was boarded with 1x10 offcuts to keep the passage clean, and the roof was slightly crowned to shed moisture. Morrison and the other neighbors had watched this construction with growing incredulity. The standard frontier approach was speed and simplicity: throw up walls, add a roof, install a stove, and burn whatever fuel was available to fight the cold. Vanderberg was spending weeks on what looked like elaborate foolishness, stacking straw 3 to 4 feet thick around every surface, creating what amounted to a giant haystack with a house buried at its center. By October, when most cabins were finished and their owners were cutting firewood for winter, Vanderberg was still fine-tuning his thermal envelope. He'd laid an 8 to 12-inch skirt of gravel and ash around the cabin's base to keep the bottom course of straw dry. He'd installed a tiny ridge vent, a 2x10-inch slot to shed moisture without losing significant heat. He'd tested his stovepipe dampers and fire buffers, ensuring he could maintain safe combustion while the cabin was sealed within its straw cocoon. The physics of his design were straightforward, though his neighbors didn't understand them. Loose straw trapped air in thousands of tiny pockets, creating an insulation value of roughly 1 to 2 R units per inch. 3 to 4 feet of properly stacked straw delivered the equivalent of R36 to R96 around the entire structure, insulation performance that dwarfed any conventional log wall. More importantly, the continuous blanket eliminated air infiltration, the true heat thief on the windswept plains. As winter deepened and the real cold arrived, Vanderberg's haystack cabin began to demonstrate capabilities that defied his neighbor's experience. While Morrison burned through 3/4 of a cord per week, trying to maintain 34 degrees in his conventional cabin, Vanderberg used less than 200 pounds of split wood for the same period, maintaining a steady 52 to 58 degrees with just 2 45-minute burns per day. His water bucket stayed liquid at 40 degrees near the wall, and his root cellar held steady at 36 degrees, well above freezing. The morning of November 15th proved the method beyond any doubt. Morrison's cabin registered 29 degrees at dawn, despite a fire that had burned all night. Vanderberg emerged from his tunnel into air that could freeze spit before it hit the ground, but his buried cabin had held 54 degrees with no fire since the previous evening. The haystack had won the argument that mattered most: survival. The construction that had drawn so much mockery from Vanderberg's neighbors represented a precise adaptation of Dutch agricultural engineering to plains survival needs. Where a traditional hay barrack used an adjustable roof system to protect stored fodder from above, Vanderberg had created a fixed framework that turned the hay itself into protective cladding around his living space. The technique required understanding both the structural demands of holding tons of loose material and the thermal principles that would make straw function as insulation rather than merely stored feed. Cornelius Decker had arrived at Vanderberg's homestead in early September with a wagon load of seasoned posts and the accumulated wisdom of 40 years building hay barracks in wet Dutch countryside. The first step was establishing the perimeter framework that would contain the massive straw envelope. They augured holes 3 feet deep at each corner of the cabin, positioning 5 to 6 inch diameter posts 3 to 4 feet off the existing walls. The spacing was critical. 6 to 8 feet between posts provided adequate support without requiring excessive lumber, while the offset distance allowed sufficient thickness for meaningful insulation without creating an unmanageably wide structure. Cross bracing came next, with 2x4 ties connecting each post to its neighbors, and diagonal braces preventing the frame from racking under the weight of stacked straw. Decker had learned through experience that loose hay could exert enormous lateral pressure as it settled, especially when saturated with moisture from rain or melting snow. The bracing system had to be both strong enough to contain thousands of pounds of material and flexible enough to accommodate the inevitable compression that occurred as the straw packed down over time. The stringers and hoops that would actually support the straw required careful positioning and secure attachment. Vanderberg lashed sapling stringers horizontally every 18 inches up each post, creating a grid that would prevent the straw from bulging outward or slumping as it dried and settled. Above the cabin's eave line, he added 2 circular hoops of bent hickory, positioned to keep the upper portion of the stack plumb and prevent the characteristic mushroom shape that made poorly built hay barracks shed water directly onto their contents. Before beginning the actual stacking process, Vanderberg prepared the critical moisture management systems that would determine whether his thermal envelope became an asset or a liability. He laid an 8 to 12-inch border of gravel and ash around the cabin's perimeter, creating a capillary break that would prevent ground moisture from wicking up into the bottom course of straw. This foundation skirt would later be sealed by packed snow, but during construction it provided the drainage necessary to keep the lower portions of the stack dry during the vulnerable period before winter's arrival. The stacking technique itself followed methods Decker had perfected for building hay barracks that could withstand decades of prairie weather. They forked straw onto the framework in 12 to 16-inch lifts, working methodically around the structure to maintain even thickness and prevent weak spots that could lead to catastrophic slumping. Each lift was tramped down to 8 to 10 inches using their boots and hay forks, compacting the material to a density of approximately 160 to 200 pounds per cubic foot, tight enough to provide structural stability and thermal performance, but not so dense as to eliminate the air pockets that gave straw its insulating properties. Every 3 feet of height, Vanderberg stitched the courses together using willow withes and baling twine, creating horizontal ties that distributed loads and prevented sections of the stack from separating during high winds or uneven settling. This stitching technique was adapted directly from hay barrack construction, where similar ties kept stored fodder intact through seasons of expansion and contraction caused by moisture changes and temperature cycles. The most technically demanding aspect of the construction involved creating safe clearances around the stovepipe while maintaining the thermal continuity of the straw envelope. Vanderberg had learned from Wilhelm Hoffmann's hotbed construction that biological materials and combustion heat required careful separation and monitoring. Around the stovepipe penetration, he installed an 18-inch ring of packed mineral soil, a mixture of clay, sand, and ash, contained within a cylindrical sheet metal collar that extended from ground level to 2 feet above the roof line. This fire buffer served multiple functions beyond simple heat protection. The mineral soil provided thermal mass that absorbed and moderated temperature fluctuations from the stove, preventing the rapid heating and cooling cycles that could cause straw to smolder. The metal collar created a physical barrier that prevented any straw from migrating toward the hot surfaces, while its smooth interior allowed for easy inspection and cleaning. Most importantly, the buffer zone was sized to accommodate the thermal expansion that occurred when the stovepipe reached operating temperatures of 300 to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The tunnel entrance represented Vanderberg's synthesis of Plains wind wisdom and Dutch moisture management principles. Joseph Crow Feather had explained how northwest gales behaved on open ground, carrying not just cold air but fine snow particles that could infiltrate even small gaps in a structure's envelope. The tunnel needed to stop this infiltration while providing access that didn't compromise the thermal barrier. Vanderberg constructed the tunnel using 2 parallel rails set 3 feet apart, with hickory hoops spaced every 3 feet to maintain the opening's dimensions under the weight of surrounding straw. The tunnel extended 10 feet from the cabin door, curving in an S shape that broke the direct path for wind, while creating pockets where heavier cold air could settle rather than flowing into the living space. The interior dimensions, 3 feet wide and 5 feet high, were sized to accommodate a person carrying firewood or water buckets while minimizing the volume of cold air that entered each time the passage was used. The tunnel's roof required the same careful attention to moisture management that governed the main structure. Vanderberg crowned the roof slightly to shed water, then covered it with a thatch cap woven from the longest, straightest straw available. The interior face was lined with 1x10 board offcuts, creating a clean surface that could be swept and maintained without disturbing the surrounding straw structure. Ventilation control represented the final technical challenge in creating a structure that could breathe without losing thermal efficiency. Vanderberg installed a single ridge vent, a narrow slot measuring 2x10 inches, positioned at the highest point of the straw envelope. This opening was sized to represent less than 1% of the total roof area, sufficient to allow moisture vapor to escape without creating significant heat loss. A simple damper system allowed him to adjust the vent opening based on interior humidity levels and outside temperature conditions. The completed structure contained approximately 6 to 8 tons of loose straw held within a framework that measured roughly 24 by 28 feet at its base and rose to a height of 14 feet at the ridge. The thermal envelope it created around Vanderberg's cabin provided insulation equivalent to R36 to R96, depending on the final density achieved in different sections of the stack. More importantly, it eliminated virtually all air infiltration, creating a sealed environment where heat generated inside could be retained with minimal fuel input. The blizzard that would test every cabin in the township began on the morning of January 12, 1889, with a deceptive calm that fooled even experienced plain settlers. Samuel Morrison stepped outside his conventional cabin to check his thermometer and found the mercury sitting at 12 degrees, cold, but manageable for a January morning in Nebraska. The wind was light, barely stirring the snow that had fallen during the night, and visibility stretched for miles across the flat grassland. By 10 o'clock that morning, Morrison would be fighting for his family's survival in what meteorologists would later document as one of the most violent temperature drops in Plains history. The weather system that struck the Central Plains on January 12th brought with it a phenomenon that frontier families had learned to fear above all others: a temperature plunge so rapid and severe that it caught people in summer clothes at their morning chores and left them struggling to reach shelter through whiteout conditions. Within 3 hours, the temperature dropped from 12 degrees to 38 degrees below zero, while winds exceeding 60 miles per hour created a wind chill that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Morrison's cabin, built according to standard frontier practice with single-thickness log walls and gaps chinked with mud and moss, began losing its battle with the cold almost immediately. His sheet iron stove, which had maintained adequate warmth during normal winter weather, now required constant feeding just to prevent the interior temperature from falling below the freezing point. By noon, with the wind driving snow through every crack in his cabin's envelope, Morrison was burning split wood as fast as he could feed it into the firebox, yet his interior temperature had dropped to 34 degrees. The thermal demands placed on Morrison's heating system during the crisis revealed the fundamental weakness of conventional Plains construction. His cabin's total heat loss during the blizzard exceeded 8,000 British thermal units per hour, a rate that required burning nearly 100 pounds of mixed hardwood and softwood every day just to maintain minimal livability. The stove's sheet iron construction, designed for normal winter conditions, glowed red hot as Morrison tried to extract maximum heat from each piece of fuel, yet the cabin's poor insulation and massive air infiltration defeated his efforts. 2 miles away, Vanderberg monitored the same weather system from inside his straw-shrouded cabin with the calm attention of a man whose shelter was performing exactly as designed. His interior temperature, measured by a mercury thermometer mounted on the cabin's center wall, held steady at 54 degrees despite winds that were driving snow particles through gaps in structures throughout the township. The thermal envelope created by his straw barrier was demonstrating insulation performance that his neighbors had dismissed as impossible. The physics governing Vanderberg's superior performance during the crisis were straightforward but revolutionary in their application to Plains homesteading. Where Morrison's cabin lost heat through conduction, convection, and massive air infiltration, Vanderberg's structure had eliminated virtually all thermal bridges and air movement. The 3 to 4 foot thickness of straw provided continuous insulation with an effective R value between 36 and 96, depending on density and moisture content. More critically, the straw envelope had created what amounted to a sealed thermal barrier with controlled ventilation, preventing the wind-driven heat loss that was destroying Morrison's efforts to stay warm. Vanderberg's fuel consumption during the 10-day crisis that followed the initial blizzard provided measurable proof of his method's effectiveness. While Morrison burned through nearly 3/4 of a cord per week, trying to maintain temperatures in the mid-30s, Vanderberg used approximately 200 pounds of split wood for the same period, achieving interior temperatures 21 degrees warmer with less than 1/4 the fuel input. His morning routine consisted of 2 controlled burns lasting 45 minutes each, using his stove's damper system to extract maximum heat from each piece of wood while maintaining safe combustion temperatures. The biological heating effect that Wilhelm Hofmann had explained during construction began manifesting itself as the crisis deepened and snow accumulated around the straw envelope. The outer courses of Vanderberg's stack, maintaining moisture content between 15 and 20%, began generating low-level decomposition heat as microorganisms broke down organic matter in the absence of free oxygen. This controlled fermentation process, similar to the mechanisms Hofmann used in his market garden hotbeds, raised the temperature of the hay mass to between 80 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The radiant warmth from this biological heating process, conducted through the straw mass toward the cabin walls, provided an additional thermal boost that Vanderberg could feel as a gentle warmth radiating from the interior surfaces of his log walls. This effect, while modest compared to the heat from his stove, contributed several degrees to his overall interior temperature and helped maintain the stable thermal environment that kept his cabin livable during the worst conditions. Temperature measurements taken throughout the crisis documented the superior performance of Vanderberg's thermal management system across every aspect of winter survival. While Morrison's water bucket filmed over with ice each night, despite being placed near his overworked stove, Vanderberg stayed liquid at 40 degrees near the wall and 46 degrees at the cabin's center. His root cellar, insulated by the same straw envelope that protected his living space, maintained temperatures between 34 and 38 degrees, well above the freezing point that destroyed Morrison's stored potatoes and other provisions. The safety systems Vanderberg had incorporated into his design proved their worth during the extended period of maximum heating demand. His stovepipe collar, surrounded by packed mineral soil and isolated from combustible materials by 18 inches of clearance, showed no signs of scorching or dangerous heat buildup even when he maintained continuous low fires for warmth. The sheet metal barrier remained cool enough to touch with bare hands, while the mineral soil buffer absorbed and moderated the thermal cycling that occurred each time he banked the fire or added fuel. Morrison's struggle to maintain adequate heat revealed the deadly arithmetic of conventional plains construction during extreme weather events. His stove, designed for intermittent use during normal winter conditions, began showing signs of dangerous overheating as he pushed it beyond its safe operating limits. The sheet iron construction glowed cherry red during maximum firing, creating fire hazards and structural stresses that threatened both the stove's integrity and the cabin's safety. Despite these risks, Morrison had no choice but to continue overdriving his heating system or watch his family succumb to cold that had already proven fatal to neighbors with less adequate fuel supplies. Vanderberg's tunnel entrance, dismissed by Morrison as an unnecessary complication, demonstrated its value as an essential component of his thermal management system. The S-curved passage, extending 10 feet from his cabin door, created a series of air traps that prevented the wind-driven cold infiltration that was overwhelming Morrison's directly exposed entrance. Temperature measurements taken at different points along the tunnel showed a progressive warming effect, with air entering the cabin at 42 degrees compared to the 38 below zero temperature outside. By the end of the 10-day crisis, Vanderberg's straw-shrouded cabin had proven that frontier heating could be both more effective and more efficient than conventional methods. While Morrison and his neighbors had burned their way through precious fuel supplies just to survive, Vanderberg had maintained superior comfort using a fraction of their wood consumption, demonstrating principles of thermal efficiency that would not become widely understood until decades later. The transformation in Samuel Morrison's attitude began on the fourth day of the crisis, when his 18-month-old daughter developed the wheezing cough that frontier families recognized as the first sign of dangerous cold exposure. Morrison had burned through half his remaining wood supply trying to keep his cabin above freezing, yet the interior temperature had dropped to 29 degrees, despite a fire that consumed split logs as fast as he could feed them. His wife, Sarah, had bundled the baby in every blanket they owned, but the child's breathing grew more labored as the night wore on and frost began forming on the interior walls within 3 feet of their overworked stove. At dawn on January 16th, with his thermometer reading 41 degrees below zero and his fuel supplies critically low, Morrison made the decision that would mark his complete reversal on Vanderberg's methods. Wrapping his family in buffalo robes, he carried his daughter through the howling wind to the barely visible mound of snow and straw that marked his neighbor's buried cabin. The tunnel entrance, which Morrison had ridiculed as an unnecessary complication, provided immediate relief from the cutting wind as he pushed through the S-curved passage that seemed to grow warmer with each step toward Vanderberg's door. The contrast between the two living environments was so dramatic that Morrison initially suspected Vanderberg's thermometer was faulty. Inside the straw-shrouded cabin, the air temperature held steady at 52 degrees, 23 degrees warmer than Morrison's own cabin, despite Vanderberg's stove, showing only the faint glow of banked coals, rather than the cherry-red overheating that Morrison's heating system required. The baby's breathing began to ease within minutes of entering the warm environment, and Sarah Morrison found herself able to remove the heavy outer wrappings that had been necessary to prevent hypothermia in their own home. Vanderberg welcomed the Morrison family with the quiet courtesy of a man whose methods had been vindicated by results rather than argument. He explained that his stove had required only 2 brief firing periods during the previous 24 hours, 45 minutes each morning and evening, compared to Morrison's continuous feeding schedule that was rapidly exhausting his fuel supply. The thermal envelope created by the straw barrier had reduced the cabin's heat loss to less than 2,000 British thermal units per hour, allowing Vanderberg to maintain comfortable temperatures with approximately 75 pounds of wood per day. Word of the Morrison family's refuge spread through the township, despite the continuing blizzard conditions. Margaret Walsh, the community's midwife who made winter rounds on sled runners, had been monitoring cabin conditions throughout the crisis and documenting interior temperatures as part of her assessment of infant and elderly survival prospects. Her pocket thermometer confirmed Vanderberg's readings and provided the objective measurements that transformed local skepticism into genuine interest in his construction methods. Walsh's documentation revealed performance differences that extended beyond simple temperature comparisons. Vanderberg's cabin maintained interior dew point temperatures above 25 degrees, preventing the condensation and ice formation that plagued conventional structures during extreme cold spells. His water supplies remained liquid at temperatures that froze solid in neighboring cabins, while his root cellar preserved vegetables at 36 degrees when Morrison's storage area had dropped below 28 degrees and destroyed his winter food supplies. The biological heating effect that Wilhelm Hofmann had predicted became clearly visible during the extended cold period as neighbors began circling Vanderberg's installation with growing curiosity. On calm mornings, they could observe fog lifting from the top of the straw envelope as the fermenting outer courses generated controlled decomposition heat. The visible warmth rising from the structure provided compelling evidence that Vanderberg's design was actively producing thermal energy rather than merely conserving it. Thomas Brennan, a young homesteader whose limited timber resources and abundant straw harvest made him an ideal candidate for adopting Vanderberg's methods, began taking careful notes on fuel consumption and temperature management during his daily visits to check on the Morrison family. Brennan's tally book documented wood usage, firing schedules, and interior temperature readings that would later provide the quantitative foundation for evaluating the method's effectiveness across different cabin sizes and construction types. The practical instruction that emerged from these daily observations focused on immediately applicable modifications that could improve conventional cabin performance without requiring complete reconstruction. Vanderberg demonstrated how a 3-foot straw skirt around a cabin's foundation could reduce cold infiltration by more than 50%, explaining the techniques for stacking, stitching, and moisture management that prevented rot and settling problems. These partial implementations of his methods provided neighbors with measurable improvements in fuel efficiency and interior comfort. Morrison, whose initial skepticism had given way to careful study, began documenting the specific techniques that could be adapted to conventional construction. Vanderburg showed him how to create effective fire buffers around stovepipes using readily available materials like clay, sand, and sheet metal, reducing the fire hazards associated with overheated heating systems. The installation of simple damper controls and ash management systems improved combustion efficiency and reduced the dangerous overheating that had threatened Morrison's stove during the crisis. The construction of small cold porches, measuring 3 by 5 feet and attached to existing cabin entrances, emerged as another immediately practical adaptation of Vanderburg's tunnel principle. These buffer spaces, which cost less than $5 in materials and could be built in a single day, reduced the thermal shock that occurred each time a cabin door opened during severe weather. 4 families implemented this modification during the remaining winter months and reported dramatic reductions in interior temperature fluctuations and fuel consumption. Vanderburg's moisture management techniques proved equally valuable for neighbors struggling with condensation problems that created ice buildup on interior walls and compromised insulation performance. His methods for controlling humidity through minimal ventilation, combined with proper vapor barriers and thermal mass positioning, eliminated the frost formation that had made Morrison's cabin increasingly difficult to heat as the crisis continued. The measurable results documented by Walsh and Brennan provided objective validation of Vanderburg's thermal management principles. Cabins implementing even partial straw banking reported wood savings between 35 and 60% during the 2-week period following the initial blizzard, while interior temperatures remained 5 to 10 degrees warmer than comparable. Unmodified structures. Root cellars protected by straw skirts maintained temperatures above 34 degrees, preventing the food losses that had devastated families relying on conventional storage methods. By the time the weather system finally moved east and temperatures began their gradual return towards seasonal norms, Vanderburg had quietly become the township's acknowledged expert on winter survival construction. Morrison, whose initial ridicule had given way to respectful attention, found himself recommending Vanderburg's methods to neighbors who were already planning modifications for the following winter. The man who had been dismissed as a fool for burying his cabin in a haystack had demonstrated principles of thermal efficiency that would influence regional building practices for generations. The social transformation was as complete as it was undramatic. Vanderburg made no speeches about vindication and offered no reproaches to those who had mocked his methods. Instead, he shared his knowledge freely with anyone willing to learn, understanding that frontier survival depended on community resilience rather than individual superiority. The haystack cabin had proved its worth through measurable performance during the ultimate test, converting skeptics through results rather than argument. The spring thaw of 1889 arrived with the gradual warming that frontier families welcomed as deliverance from winter's siege. By late March, daytime temperatures had risen sufficiently to begin melting the massive snowdrifts that had accumulated around every structure in the township. Vanderburg faced the task that his neighbors had been predicting would prove the fatal flaw in his haystack construction, removing tons of straw that had been compacted by months of snow and ice without discovering a rotted, moldy disaster beneath. The dismantling process that Vanderburg undertook in early April revealed the engineering precision that had made his thermal envelope successful. Working methodically from the top down, he removed the straw in the same systematic courses in which it had been installed, using hay forks to lift sections that remained remarkably intact despite months of extreme weather exposure. The stitching system of willow withes and baling twine had prevented the slumping and separation that could have created weak points where moisture penetration might have caused rot or structural failure. Samuel Morrison arrived with several other neighbors on the morning when Vanderburg reached the level of his cabin's eave line, expecting to find evidence of the moisture damage that conventional wisdom insisted must have occurred. Instead, they discovered log walls that were completely dry, with no signs of mold, rot, or moisture staining that typically appeared on structures subjected to prolonged humidity exposure. The chinking between the logs remained intact and showed no evidence of the freeze-thaw cycling that commonly damaged conventional construction during severe winters. The absence of moisture problems demonstrated the effectiveness of van der Berg's vapor management system, which had controlled humidity within the thermal envelope while preventing condensation that could have created destructive ice formation. His ridge vent, sized to less than 1% of the total roof area, had provided sufficient air exchange to remove excess moisture vapor without creating significant heat loss. The gravel and ash foundation skirt had prevented capillary moisture from wicking up into the straw envelope, while the sheet metal collars around the stovepipe had maintained dry conditions around the most critical penetration points. Margaret Walsh documented the structural condition of van der Berg's cabin as part of her ongoing assessment of winter survival techniques that had proven effective during the crisis. Her notes recorded no evidence of pest intrusion, structural damage, or deterioration that could be attributed to the unconventional insulation methods. The cabin's interior showed less wear and stress than conventional structures that had been subjected to the thermal cycling and moisture problems associated with inadequate heating and poor vapor control. The straw itself, when examined by Thomas Brennan and other neighbors interested in adopting similar methods, showed remarkably little degradation despite its exposure to months of harsh weather. The outer 6 inches had weathered to a gray-brown patina that actually improved its water-shedding characteristics, while the inner layers remained golden and structurally sound. Wilhelm Hoffmann, examining the material from his perspective as a market gardener familiar with biological heating processes, confirmed that the controlled fermentation had proceeded exactly as intended, generating beneficial heat without creating the anaerobic conditions that would have led to putrefaction. The complete removal of the straw envelope took van der Berg and 2 assistants 3 days of steady work, demonstrating that the seasonal construction cycle was both practical and economically viable. The straw that came off the cabin retained sufficient quality to serve as valuable livestock bedding and soil amendment, providing economic return that partially offset the initial investment in materials and labor. This reusability addressed one of the primary objections that neighbors had raised about dedicating valuable fodder to construction purposes. Van der Berg's methods began spreading through the region during the summer building season of 1889, as homesteaders prepared for the following winter with knowledge gained from the previous year's crisis. Thomas Brennan implemented a full straw envelope around his 14 by 16 cabin, following van der Berg's specifications for post spacing, straw thickness, and moisture management. James Murphy and his brother installed 3-foot straw skirts around their existing cabins, adopting the perimeter insulation technique without committing to complete reconstruction. The township's adoption rate reflected both the documented effectiveness of van der Berg's methods and the practical constraints that governed frontier construction decisions. Of the 12 families who had witnessed the performance differences during the January crisis, 4 implemented full straw envelopes for the 1889 to 1890 winter season. 8 others adopted partial measures, including foundation skirting, improved fire management systems, and cold porch construction that incorporated van der Berg's principles without requiring complete rebuilding. Morrison, whose family had survived the crisis only through van der Berg's hospitality, became an unexpected advocate for the thermal management principles he had once ridiculed. His documentation of fuel savings and comfort improvements provided practical evidence that convinced neighbors who remained skeptical of more dramatic construction modifications. Morrison's installation of a 3-foot straw skirt around his cabin's windward walls reduced his wood consumption by 38% during the following winter, while maintaining interior temperatures 5 to 7 degrees higher than the previous season. The agricultural extension system that was beginning to develop in Nebraska during the 1890s took notice of the regional adoption of van der Berg's methods through the documentation provided by Walsh, Brennan, and other observers who had recorded quantitative data on thermal performance. County Agricultural Agent Robert Crawford, arriving in the area in 1891, interviewed families who had implemented various aspects of the straw insulation system and compiled their experiences into bulletins that recommended thermal economy measures for Plains homesteaders. Crawford's official validation of van der Berg's principles represented the transformation of a mocked innovation into accepted regional practice. His circulars described straw banking, envelope insulation, and biological heating as proven methods for improving winter survival prospects on the plains, citing specific fuel savings and temperature performance data collected from local practitioners. The techniques that had once seemed foolishly excessive were now documented as efficient adaptations to environmental conditions that defeated conventional construction approaches. The broader influence of Vanderburg's innovations extended beyond immediate regional adoption to connect with parallel developments in plains construction that were occurring throughout the 1890s. In the Nebraska sandhills, settlers were using baled straw and hay to construct entire buildings, validating straw as a legitimate structural material when properly detailed and protected from moisture. These straw bale pioneers, working independently of Vanderburg's envelope methods, confirmed that straw could provide both structural integrity and superior thermal performance when used with appropriate construction techniques. The Dutch hay barrack tradition that had informed Vanderburg's original concept found new expression in American agricultural architecture as farmers adapted Old World storage methods to plains conditions. The principle of sheltering what mattered most, whether harvested crops or human habitations, proved universally applicable to environments where conventional construction materials were scarce, and thermal demands exceeded the capacity of standard building techniques. Wilhelm Hofmann's biological heating methods, demonstrated in Vanderburg's outer straw courses, anticipated the larger-scale compost heating systems that would gain popularity in the 20th century as renewable energy technologies. The controlled fermentation that had provided supplemental warmth to Vanderburg's cabin represented early application of principles that would later be developed into comprehensive heating systems for greenhouses and residential buildings. By 1895, Vanderburg's Haystack cabin had established a documented lineage of thermal management techniques that influenced regional building practices throughout the Central Plains. The methods that had been dismissed as the folly of a misguided immigrant had proven their worth through measurable performance during the ultimate test of frontier survival, demonstrating that the best construction solutions often came from adapting traditional knowledge to new environmental challenges rather than accepting conventional wisdom that had never been tested under extreme conditions.